The silver tray did not just hold a letter, it held the death warrant of my freedom. I stood in the grand library of Oakhaven Square, the ancestral home of the Dukes of Penhaligon. My mother, the Dowager Duchess Augusta, tightened my cravat until I could barely swallow. Her fingers were cold, like marble. "You are not a man, Peregrine," she whispered, her voice a freezing wind that cut through my soul. "You are the 10th Duke. You are a collection of acres, coal mines, and bloodlines. To think of your own heart is not only selfish, it is a betrayal of the crown." With a flick of her wrist, she tossed my personal journal into the roaring fireplace. I had spent years filling those pages with sketches of the common life I craved, far away from the stiff collars and fake smiles of the nobility. I watched the leather curl and the pages blacken, the smell of burning ink filling my lungs like poison. I had spent 28 years being molded into a statue, but today the mold had become a tomb. My mother had already sent the announcements to the newspapers. I was to marry Lady Beatrix, a woman with the warmth of a tombstone, simply because her lands joined ours. The room felt like it was shrinking as the heavy oak doors opened. The first guests arrived for tea, their laughter sounding like glass breaking in my ears. They came to celebrate a union that felt like a death sentence. Augusta adjusted my family signet ring with such force that it bruised my bone. "Smile, Peregrine," she hissed. "The world expects to see a masterpiece, not a man." I looked at the window, where the thick London fog was rolling in. I realized then that if I did not leave tonight, the person named Peregrine would die forever, leaving only a hollow duke behind. I was not just facing a bad marriage, I was facing the total erasure of my life. My mother had spent my entire life telling me that my feelings did not matter. She treated me like a piece of furniture that had to be placed in the right corner. I felt a sudden, sharp spark of rebellion in my chest. I waited until the house was full of music and wine, then I slipped away to my dressing room. I tore off the medals and the silk sash. I found an old wool coat and a pair of sturdy boots. I was going to disappear. I slipped out through the servants' entrance, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The cold night air hit my face, and for the first time in my life, it tasted like freedom. I had a handful of gold coins and a fake name, Pippin. I walked until my feet ached, moving away from the polished streets of the West End and toward the soot-stained corners of the East End. That was where I found the Bluebell boarding house. It was a tall, leaning building that smelled of boiled cabbage and coal smoke. I knocked on the door, and it was opened by a woman named Rosalind. She did not curtsy. She did not look at my shoes. She simply leaned against the frame with a wet rag in her hand and eyes that looked like they had seen everything. "We don't take drunks or poets," she said, her voice rough and honest. I told her my name was Pippin and that I needed a room. She looked at my soft, pale hands and laughed. "You look like you've never held a shovel in your life, Pippin. Can you pay, or are you just a pretty face looking for a handout?" I paid for a week in advance, and Rosalind led me up a creaking staircase to a room no bigger than a closet. It was damp and cold, but it was mine. The next morning, I followed the other men from the house down to the docks. I found a foreman who needed men to haul heavy timber. The work was brutal. By midday, my palms were raw and bleeding, and my back felt like it was breaking. Every time I wanted to stop, I pictured my mother's cold face and the fireplace at Oakhaven Square. I would rather bleed here than be a puppet there. When I returned to the boarding house that evening, I was covered in sawdust and sweat. Rosalind was in the kitchen, teaching her younger sister, Hattie, how to mend a coat. She looked at my trembling hands and sighed. Without a word, she pushed a bowl of hot stew toward me. "You're a fool for doing work your body isn't built for," she said, but her voice was a little softer. I realized then that Rosalind was the one keeping this whole house together. She was a widow, working herself to the bone to protect Hattie. Living at the Bluebell was like learning a new language. Everything was loud, dirty, and real. One morning, a wealthy tenant who lived on the second floor started screaming. He claimed someone had stolen his gold locket. He pointed his finger at Rosalind, calling her a thief and a lowlife. The man threatened to call the police and have the house shut down. I saw the terror in Rosalind's eyes, and something inside me snapped. I used the observational skills my tutors had drilled into me for years. I noticed a small tear in the man's own coat pocket and a glint of gold near the leg of his chair. I stepped forward and reached down, pulling the locket from where it had fallen into the floorboards. "It wasn't stolen," I said firmly. "It was dropped by a man who was too busy shouting to look at his own feet." The tenant turned red and walked away, grumbling. Rosalind looked at me with a strange expression. She was grateful I had saved her from the street, but she was also suspicious. "You talk like a man who has never been shouted at before," she whispered. The peace did not last long. A few days later, while I was walking back from the docks with a heavy heart, I saw something that made me freeze. Pinned to a brick wall was a missing poster. It was a sketch of my face, looking proud and distant in my ducal uniform. The reward offered was more money than anyone in the East End would earn in a lifetime. My mother had hired the Hounds, a group of ruthless private investigators, to track me down. I pulled my cap lower over my eyes and hurried back to the boarding house. I felt like the city was closing in on me. I saw a black carriage with the Penhaligon crest turning a corner 2 streets away. Augusta was not just looking for a son, she was looking for her lost property. I realized that my presence was a danger to everyone at the Bluebell. If they found me there, Rosalind and Hattie would be accused of kidnapping a duke. I went to my room and sat in the dark, wondering if I should run again. But where could I go? I was starting to care about the people in this house. A thick, grey fog settled over the city, and with it came a wave of illness. Several tenants at the boarding house fell sick with a high fever. Rosalind was exhausted, trying to nurse everyone while still doing the laundry and cooking. I couldn't stand by and watch her collapse. I stayed awake for 3 nights, moving from room to room. I cooled foreheads with damp cloths and brewed herbal teas. I held the hands of men who were shaking with chills. During those long, quiet hours, Rosalind and I worked side by side. We didn't talk much, but the silence between us started to change. She saw that I wasn't just a pretty face or a clumsy laborer. She saw that I was gentle and patient. One night, while the rest of the house was finally sleeping, she sat down on the floor next to me. "Who are you really, Pippin?" she asked softly. "You have the hands of a gentleman but the heart of a saint. Men like you don't just land in the East End by accident." I wanted to tell her everything, but I was afraid she would hate me for the lie. The truth almost came out in the most painful way. While I was helping Rosalind move a heavy bed frame to clean under it, my rough work shirt caught on a jagged piece of wood. The fabric tore open across my shoulder, revealing a dark mark on my skin. It was the Penhaligon family crest, a small but detailed tattoo of a hawk. It was a tradition for the men of my house to receive it when they turned 21. Rosalind gasped as she saw it. She knew enough to recognize that it was a noble mark. Her face went pale, and she stepped back, clutching her apron. "That's a crest," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Only the highborn wear marks like that." I had to think fast. My heart was racing so hard I thought it would burst. I was a servant at Oakhaven Square. I lied, the words tasting like ash. The Duke was a cruel man. He branded his personal staff like cattle. That is why I ran away. Rosalind looked at the mark and then at my eyes. She reached out and touched the scar with a shaking finger. "I'm so sorry," she said. The next day, Rosalind seemed distracted. She was cleaning out a trunk of her late husband's old belongings when she found a hidden letter tucked into the lining. She sat on the floor, reading it over and over. When I came in, she looked up at me with eyes full of tears and a new kind of anger. "My husband didn't die of a simple illness, Pippin," she said. "He was a brilliant engineer. He had designed a new safety pump for the coal mines. This letter says he was going to meet with a noble family to sell it, but they threatened him. They wanted the design for free." She showed me the wax seal on the back of the envelope. My blood turned to ice. It was the red wax seal of Oakhaven Square. My own family had been the ones who crushed her life before it even began. My mother had likely ordered the silencing of a man just to save a few pounds in the family mines. I felt a deep, burning shame. I was living under the roof of a woman my family had destroyed. I realized I was part of the very monster she hated. The danger moved from the past to the present very quickly. I was at the docks, lifting heavy crates, when a flashy carriage pulled up near the water. It was Lady Beatrix, my jilted fiancée. She was accompanied by a group of men in dark coats, the hounds. She was holding a lace handkerchief to her nose to block the smell of the river. She looked disgusted by everything she saw. "He has to be here," I heard her snap at the investigators. My scout said a man matching his description was seen hauling timber. I ducked behind a stack of salt barrels, my heart pounding. I watched as they moved through the crowd, showing my portrait to the other workers. I had to stay perfectly still for an hour, the salt stinging my eyes and the cold air biting my skin. I realized the noose was tightening. Augusta and Beatrix were not going to stop until they had me back in a cage. If they found me here, they would realize I had been living with Rosalind. They would destroy her just to spite me. I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. That evening, a heavy rain kept everyone inside the parlor of the Bluebell. In the corner of the room sat an old, out-of-tune piano with several broken keys. Hattie was trying to pick out a simple tune, but she was struggling. Without thinking, I sat down beside her. I began to play a complex piece by Mozart that my tutors had forced me to master. My fingers moved with a grace that a dock worker should never have. The room went silent. Even the men who were playing cards stopped to listen. The music was beautiful, but it was also a confession. I was playing with a level of skill that took years of expensive training. When I finished, I looked up and saw Rosalind standing in the doorway. She wasn't smiling. She looked at me with a mix of awe and deep suspicion. She knew that my story about being a branded servant was falling apart piece by piece. Servants didn't play like masters. "You're a very good liar, Pippin," she said quietly. The other tenants started to whisper. The secret I was keeping was starting to leak out like water from a cracked jar. The rain didn't stop, and neither did Rosalind's questions. Late that night, she found me sitting on the back porch, watching the water run into the gutters. She sat down next to me, her shoulder brushing mine. "Tell me the truth," she said. "I don't care if you're a criminal or a spy. Just don't tell me you were a servant." I took a long breath. I felt the weight of the Duke's title pressing down on me, even here in the dark. I didn't tell her I was the Duke, but I admitted that I was the one who had run away from the monster at Oakhaven Square. I told her I hated the world of the nobility and that I just wanted to be a man who earned his own way. "I'm not who they want me to be," I whispered. Rosalind looked at me for a long time, then she reached out and took my hand. In that moment, the distance between a duke and a widow vanished. We leaned in, and our lips met in a first, desperate kiss. It tasted like rain and hope. But as we pulled apart, I saw a dark figure watching us from the alley. The figure in the alley was one of the hounds. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Rosalind screaming. I ran downstairs to find the kitchen in shambles. Hattie was gone. A note had been pinned to the table with a dagger. It said that the little bird would be returned once the lost hawk came home. My mother had finally played her most cruel card. She didn't kidnap Rosalind, because she knew I would just run away with her. She took the innocent child instead. Rosalind was hysterical, sobbing into her apron. "They took her, Pippin. Men in black coats took my sister." I felt a cold, hard rage settle in my chest. It was the same rage I had felt when my mother burned my journals. I realized that the Pippin version of me wasn't strong enough to save Hattie. To fight a duchess, I had to become a duke again. I took Rosalind's hands in mine and looked her in the eye. "I will bring her back," I promised. "But to do it, I have to go to a place I never wanted to see again." I walked through the front gates of Oakhaven Square dressed in my muddy dock clothes and torn wool coat. The guards tried to stop me, but I looked them in the eye with a cold authority they recognized instantly. "Move," I said. They stepped back in shock. I walked through the grand entrance, my boots leaving mud on the white marble floors. Servants dropped trays of silver at the sight of me. I looked like a ghost that had crawled out of a grave. I walked straight into the drawing room where Augusta was sitting, calmly sipping tea. She looked up at me, her eyes narrowing with triumph. "You look like a beggar, Peregrine," she said. "But at least you've come home." I didn't care about her insults. I demanded to see Hattie. My mother gestured to a corner of the room, where Hattie was sitting on a silk chair, looking terrified. She was unharmed, but she was a prisoner in a golden cage. I realized then that my mother didn't just want me back, she wanted to prove that she owned me and everyone I cared about. I was back in the tomb. Augusta released Hattie, sending her back to the East End in a carriage, but she made it clear that if I ever left again, the girl would disappear for good. I was forced back into my ducal duties. I was bathed, shaved, and dressed in stiff silk and heavy velvet. I felt like I was being buried alive. My mother held a re-engagement dinner with Lady Beatrix, but I refused to speak. I sat at the head of the long table like a hollow shell. I didn't eat, and I didn't drink. I was a ghost king. My mother tried to provoke me, mocking the filthy woman I had been living with. Did she smell of coal and cheap gin, Peregrine? She laughed. I kept my face as still as stone, but inside, I was planning. I realized that to win, I couldn't just run. I had to dismantle my mother's power from the inside. I started to look through the family ledgers at night, searching for the secrets she used to keep the world under her thumb. I was no longer a boy obeying his family, I was a hunter. Back at the Bluebell, Rosalind was struggling. She had her sister back, but she had lost the man she loved. Worse, she now knew the truth. One of the hounds had stayed behind to tell her exactly who Pippin was. She felt humiliated and betrayed. She believed I had been slumming it for fun, playing at being a poor man while I had a palace waiting for me. She threw my old wool coat into the street and told Hattie never to mention my name again. She felt like our kiss was a lie and our time together was just a game I played before going back to my real life. She didn't know that I was sitting in a dark library, crying over a single bluebell I had pressed into a book. She didn't know that every breath I took was for her. I sent a messenger with a letter and a bag of gold to help with the house, but she sent it back. The note she wrote was short and sharp. A duke has no place in a boarding house. Do not send your charity to cover your lies. While searching the secret safes in my father's old study, I found a leather-bound ledger that was hidden behind a brick. It wasn't about land or taxes. It was a list of special acquisitions. I found the name of Rosalind's late husband. The ledger proved that my mother, Augusta, had not only stolen the pump design but had paid a corrupt doctor to give the man a medicine that caused his heart to stop. It was murder. She had done it to ensure the Penhaligon mines became the most profitable in England. My blood ran cold as I realized the depth of her evil. She hadn't just been a strict mother, she was a criminal who used the family name to hide her blood-stained hands. This ledger was the key to everything. It was the only way to destroy her legally and give Rosalind the justice she deserved. I hid the ledger in my boot, the same way I used to hide my sketches. I knew I had to get this information to someone who couldn't be bought by the Duchess. Augusta announced a grand restoration ball to celebrate my return and my upcoming wedding to Beatrix. It was to be the biggest event of the season. I realized this was my chance. I sent a secret message to Silas Vane, a wealthy merchant who hated the old nobility, and asked him for a favor. On the night of the ball, while the house was filled with the smell of expensive perfumes and the sound of violins, a carriage arrived. Out stepped a distinguished guest, a woman draped in a heavy veil and a dress of deep midnight blue. No one recognized her. I met her in the hallway and led her into the ballroom. It was Rosalind. I had used Silas Vane's influence to give her a fake title for the night. She looked at the gold-leafed ceilings and the shimmering diamonds with a look of pure disgust. "So this is the world you came from," she whispered. I leaned in close. "This is the world I am going to burn down tonight, Rosalind. Just stay close to me." We walked into the center of the room together. The music faltered as we entered. Augusta stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied the mysterious guest. She recognized Rosalind's eyes immediately. The dowager's face turned into a mask of pure fury. She signaled for the guards, but I stepped in front of her. We walked toward the rose garden, away from the prying ears of the guests. "How dare you bring that common filth into this house?" Augusta hissed once we were alone. She threatened to have Rosalind arrested for trespassing and to destroy what was left of her reputation. Rosalind didn't flinch. She stepped forward and looked the Duchess in the eye. "You've already destroyed my life once, Augusta. You killed my husband for a pump design." My mother laughed, a cold, sharp sound. "You have no proof, girl. You are a bug beneath my boot." Then, I reached into my coat and pulled out the secret ledger. I held it up so the moonlight hit the pages. "I have the proof, Mother. And the High Solicitor is already waiting in the library." Augusta tried to grab the ledger, but I held it out of her reach. "It's over," I said. But my mother was a cornered wolf. She signaled to Alistair, who was actually my cousin and her secret accomplice, to snatch the book. A struggle broke out in the dark garden. In the chaos, Alistair realized the game was up and tried to flee with the family jewels that were kept in a display case for the ball. These weren't just diamonds, they were the legal dowries of several noble families that Augusta had cheated over the years. Rosalind and I didn't chase the ledger, we chased the jewels. We knew that returning them would prove Augusta's financial crimes to the entire nobility. We caught Alistair at the gates, the jewels spilling onto the gravel like frozen tears. The guests had poured out onto the lawn, watching the Duke and a common woman tackle a thief. The perfect image of the Penhaligon family was shattered forever. I looked at my mother, who was standing on the porch, realized she had lost her grip on everyone. The next morning, the scandal was the only thing anyone talked about in London. I didn't hide. I called for a formal House of Lords hearing against my own mother. It was an act of social suicide, but I didn't care. I stood before the most powerful men in the country and presented the ledger. I told them about the murder of Rosalind's husband and the theft of the pump designs. I showed them the special acquisitions list. The room was deathly quiet. Even the most cynical lords couldn't ignore the evidence of a duchess committing murder for profit. Rosalind stood by my side the entire time, her head held high. She wasn't afraid of their titles anymore. She told them her story in a clear, steady voice. For the first time, the voices of the East End were being heard in the highest court in the land. The solicitor announced that a full investigation would begin. Augusta was placed under house arrest, her power vanishing like smoke. I felt the golden shackle of the ducal ring finally start to loosen. As the investigation deepened, a new twist emerged. Lady Beatrix, who I was supposed to marry, came to me in private. She wasn't angry, she was relieved. She confessed that she had been forced into the engagement just like I was. She actually loved a common stable hand and had been terrified of what Augusta would do if she found out. "She's a monster to everyone, Peregrine," Beatrix said. She offered to testify against my mother, providing evidence of how Augusta had blackmailed other families to keep them in line. With Beatrix on our side, the case against the Dowager became unbreakable. We realized that my mother wasn't just protecting a bloodline, she was running a criminal empire built on fear. Rosalind and I realized that we weren't just fighting for our own love, we were fighting for the freedom of dozens of people. The Duke and the Sempstress had become the leaders of a revolution. We spent our nights planning the final legal blow that would end the Penhaligon reign of terror forever. Augusta was desperate. She realized that she couldn't win in court, so she tried one last, cowardly act. She invited me to a final tea to discuss the transition of the estate. She acted like a defeated woman, her voice soft and trembling. But as I watched her pour the tea, I noticed her hand shake slightly as she dropped a white powder into my cup. It was a poison that wouldn't kill, but would cause a mental breakdown, making me appear unfit to hold the title. She wanted to declare me insane so she could take over as my legal guardian and stop the trial. I remembered how she used to fix my collars, always touching me with fake affection. I waited until she turned to look at a bird outside the window, and I quickly swapped the cups. I watched as she took a long sip of her own poison tea. Within minutes, her speech became slurred and her eyes grew wild. She began to confess her crimes aloud, shouting them at the walls. The solicitor, who was waiting behind the curtain, heard everything. The Dowager's madness was the final nail in her coffin, but she had one more trap. She had sent a group of hired thugs to the East End. They were ordered to burn down the Bluebell boarding house to destroy the original letters and any other evidence of her crimes. I heard the news and didn't wait for the police. I grabbed my old wool coat and rode a horse through the city streets. When I arrived, the boarding house was already surrounded by men with torches. The tenants were terrified, huddled in the street. Rosalind was standing at the door with a heavy iron skillet, refusing to let them in. "This is our home," she shouted. I rode my horse straight into the middle of the thugs, knocking them aside. I led the men of the boarding house in a counterattack. We fought with our fists and with the tools of our trades. The Duke was back in the dirt, fighting alongside the people he loved. We drove the thugs away and put out the small fires before they could spread. In the aftermath of the fight, the High Solicitor arrived with a shocking discovery from the family archives. He found a hidden birth certificate from a small village in the north. It turned out that the real 10th Duke had died as an infant, and Augusta had replaced him with a common baby from the village to keep her position as the mother of an heir. I wasn't a Penhaligon at all. I was the son of a village blacksmith. The bloodline I had been raised to protect was a complete lie. The dowager had spent 28 years abusing a boy who didn't even belong to her house. I stood in the middle of the scorched street and started to laugh. I wasn't a duke. I wasn't a collection of acres. I was just Peregrine. The solicitor told me that I could keep the secret and stay in power, or I could tell the truth and lose everything. I looked at Rosalind, who was covered in soot but looking at me with pure love. I didn't even have to think about it. I was finally free. The next day, I made a public announcement. I told the world the truth about my birth and renounced the title of Duke of Penhaligon. My mother's uncle, a kind man who had been pushed aside for years, was the true heir. I walked away from Oakhaven Square with nothing but the clothes on my back and the gold I had earned at the docks. The nobility was horrified. They couldn't understand why a man would choose to be a nobody when he could have been a king. But as I walked toward the East End, the air felt lighter. I wasn't a statue anymore. I was a man with a future he had chosen for himself. I arrived at the Bluebell boarding house and knocked on the door. Rosalind opened it, and for the first time, she smiled a real, wide smile. "Welcome home, Pippin," she said. I realized that losing everything was actually the greatest victory of my life. I had lost a title, but I had found my soul. I was ready to start my real life. Rosalind was not just a widow, she was a woman of incredible intelligence. Using the pump design her husband had left behind, we filed for a legal patent in her name. With the help of Silas Vane, we started a small manufacturing company. We didn't use the old noble ways of greed and fear. We paid our workers a fair wage and ensured their safety. Because the Penhaligon mines were now being run by the true, kind uncle, he agreed to use our pumps. Within months, the Penhaligon mines, the source of my mother's power, became tied to the woman she had tried to destroy. Rosalind was becoming a wealthy woman in her own right, but she never moved out of the East End. She turned the boarding house into a safe haven for women and children who had been hurt by the nobility. We were taking the wealth of the highborn and using it to fix the world they had broken. Justice wasn't just a court ruling, it was a complete reversal of fortune. The final fall of Augusta was a sight that London would never forget. Because she was no longer the mother of the Duke, she had no legal right to stay at Oakhaven Square. She was evicted from the mansion she had treated like a god. All her jewelry, her silks, and her furniture were seized to pay back the families she had robbed. She was left with a single trunk and a small amount of money. She had no friends and no family left. No noble house would take her in. In a twist of fate that only the universe could provide, she ended up seeking shelter in a boarding house. But because her name was so hated, only one house would take her, a small, soot-stained building in the East End. She walked through the door and saw a sign that read the Bluebell Sanctuary. She had to stand in line for a bowl of stew, served by the very women she used to call insects. She was finally living the life she had tried to bury me in. One afternoon, I visited the Bluebell Sanctuary to bring supplies. I saw Augusta sitting in a corner, her fine silk dress now tattered and grey. She looked at me with hollow eyes. She tried to muster her old pride, but she had nothing left. "You should have been a duke, Peregrine," she rasped. "You could have ruled them all." I sat down across from her and pushed a cup of simple tea toward her. "I was never a duke, Augusta. I was just a boy you tried to turn into a monster. But you failed." I told her that I was happy. I told her that I was working as a carpenter and that I loved the smell of wood more than the smell of old money. I didn't yell at her, and I didn't mock her. My lack of anger was the greatest punishment I could give her. She realized that she hadn't just lost her title, she had lost her power to hurt me. I stood up and walked away, leaving her alone with her memories of a house that was now a museum. A year after I first knocked on the door of the Bluebell, we held a wedding in the parlor. It wasn't a ducal union with thousands of guests and cold rituals. It was a celebration of love. The room was decorated with hundreds of bluebells. The tenants of the house were our guests of honor. Hattie was the flower girl, wearing a dress she had helped sew herself. I didn't wear a sash or medals, I wore a suit I had paid for with my own labor. When I looked at Rosalind, I didn't see a commoner or a social scandal. I saw my clarity. We said our vows in front of a simple priest, promising to protect each other and the house we had built together. We didn't have a palace, but we had a home. We didn't have a title, but we had a name that stood for something real. As the music started a joyful song on the old piano, I realized that I was no longer the boy who was raised to obey. I was the man who was meant to love. We stepped out into the London night, two souls who had found each other in the dark and decided to build their own light.